Ron Lindsay, as you probably know, is the president and CEO of the Center for Inquiry. We were a branch here for about 7 years, and then we did a little free thinking and decided we wanted to do our own thing. And so that's, we broke off about 3 years ago. We've been formed Free Thought Arizona. And so far it's been working. And one of the reasons it is Ron was generous with the people that were members of our group and members of CFI. He returned all the money that was given that year to get us off to a good start, and we really appreciate that. And I think we need to give Ron a big hand for doing that. He didn't have to. Ron has a PhD in philosophy from Georgetown University, and he took the job over from Paul Kurtz, who was the founder of the Center for Inquiry 7 years ago, and has made some good changes, I think, and has moved forward. At one time, we were not encouraged to work with other groups, and you see now we're working with not only local groups, but we're working with national and international groups. So I think it's a positive step, because we're all in this, the secular community needs to be coordinated and work together, and not look on somebody else as competition, if you will. I think let's stop now and let Ron give us what he's been doing lately. So thank you very much. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Jerry. There we go. Okay. Fantastic. First of all, thanks for coming out this morning. It's just very encouraging to see so many people out here on a beautiful sunny morning. It's what, upper 70s, light breeze. Of course, for you guys in Arizona, that's probably pretty boring because you get that weather all the time. But for someone who's been suffering through the winter back east, it's great. I actually walked here from the hotel. I was staying at the loft, and it was a beautiful walk. Anyway, thanks for coming out. I have to say, by the way, I was very impressed by Diane's summary of the activities you guys have been engaging in. Obviously doing a lot. It's fantastic. And as Jerry alluded to and Diane alluded to, it's really important to get work done at the grassroots level. And it doesn't really make any difference what banner it's done under, whether it's done under the Center for Inquiry banner or some other banner. The importance is furthering our common mission. And it's just fantastic to see that you guys are doing a great job of doing that. A couple things. Since I am president of the Center for Inquiry, I made this offer to people in Phoenix last night where I spoke. Be happy, obviously, to entertain questions about my book when I'm finished, but I'll be also happy to entertain questions about anything going on at the Center for Inquiry, and I promise to give you an answer if you buy a copy of my book. That's a precondition. Now seriously, be happy to talk about what we're doing at the Center. One thing we're doing at the Center, and again, it's an indication of our cooperation with various secular groups. Michael Dodora, who you may know is the chief lobbyist for our organization, also our UN representative. He just received an invitation I think 36 hours ago to participate in the Arizona Lobby Day on March 26th. So he probably will be flying out here to Arizona. And if that happens, I encourage you to meet Michael. Michael's a great guy. He's got a lot of experience, been very successful in paving the way for a lot of secular initiatives on Capitol Hill and at the United Nations. So that's just another example of how groups are working together to further our common cause. All right. Speaking of common cause, that's a nice segue into my book. Because ultimately this is, and I think Diane alluded to this in her talk, the importance of living together, right? Coming together, carrying on a conversation together. That's very important in a democratic society. And if we're going to do that, it seems to me, we need to keep religion out of the public square in the sense of it having an influence on public policy. Now, a couple ways you can do that. One, everyone could become non-religious. That's possible. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but maybe not something that's going to happen in the near term. The other is to convince people, including religious people, of the virtues of secularism. And that is one reason I wrote this book. So obviously this morning I'm going to talk about why I think secularism is important, why I think, in fact, religious people should embrace secularism as much as non-religious people. And I am also going to, for good measure, talk about the subtitle of my book, Why God Can't Tell Us What to Do. You'll see why that's important to talk about that issue. And I am going to prove that, in fact, God can't tell us what to do, and that would be the case even if there were a God. Don't think there is, but even if there were a God, he could not tell us what to do. All right, but first I'm going to start with some facts that I think are kind of interesting in themselves, but also very relevant to my thesis. And I want you to think about something for a moment, and let this sink in, because we are actually living in an unprecedented time in human history. That's what he is. Yeah, it's good. And yeah, we should be happy about this, because surveys indicate that large segments of the population, at least in developed countries, are non-religious. That is, they reject belief in God, gods, transcendent spirits of any sort. This is truly revolutionary. Because as far as we can tell, up until about the end of the 18th century, a belief in God, gods, spirits of whatever sort was nearly universal. Yes, we have some evidence of some writers and scholars who were skeptics, usually based on posthumous writings, because, for obvious reasons, it was a little risky to come out while you were alive as a skeptic. If it didn't mean actual death, it often meant social death and ostracism. And I'm sure there were some skeptics that we don't know about that just had to keep quiet. But overall, they were a very small minority. It wasn't until the Enlightenment that more people started to express openly their skepticism about religion. And it's really only been in the last 50 to 60 years that we've had widespread skepticism. Well, how widespread? Well, surveys indicate that in some countries in Europe, such as Sweden and Denmark, a majority or near majority of the population is non-religious. Phil Zuckerman, when he's here, may be talking about that because he talks about that in his recent book. Other countries, not quite a majority, but the United Kingdom has a very strong secular, non-religious population of roughly 35 to 40%. The United States, as it is in some other areas, is a bit of an outlier. With respect to developed countries, we tend to be much more religious than other developed countries. This is what I would call a conservative estimate of the non-religious population in the United States. I say it's conservative in part because it's based on a 2008 survey. This data is from the American Religious Identification Survey. But one reason I use that survey, other than the fact that it's carried out by Barry Cosman, who's on our board of directors, is that I think it's more reliable than many surveys because of the way the questions were asked. Barry and his team use open-ended questions to get at what people believe. So instead of saying, would you classify yourself as an atheist or a Catholic Christian or a Protestant Christian, rather they just invite people to describe what they believe about God or gods. But anyway, according to this survey, 12% of the American population don't believe in a God or gods, and another 12% don't believe in a personal God. So that means that for roughly a quarter of the American population, either God isn't there or he's essentially irrelevant because he plays no role in their daily lives. So those are pretty significant numbers. Again, this is conservative. It might be a little less than some numbers you've seen tossed about, and I'm going to comment on that for a second. I'm sure you've heard people quote figures about the nuns, and some figures say there's 20% of the American population are nuns. Some say higher, 25, 30%. You have to be careful with the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, figure because that actually encompasses people who are religious. All it means is that they are not affiliated with any religion. But you can be religious and just not decide you're an Episcopalian, a Methodist, or a Catholic, or what have you. So that figure probably is a bit of an exaggeration in terms of people who are actually non-religious. Again, that's one reason I like the ARIS survey. Another reason I like the ARIS survey is it helps in terms of refuting pushback from some religious people. I don't know if you ever had discussions with religious people about the percentage of non-religious. I do, just because it's kind of part of my job, so it happens from time to time. And one thing I hear often is, oh, this whole idea about the non-religious, they're growing, there are more and more non-religious people. That's just nonsense. It's an exaggeration. It's a myth. Because surveys indicate that the number or percentage of people who identify as atheists is no more than around 3%, which is true. That's what the surveys indicate, including the average survey, 3% atheists. Well, why is that? It's because there's still a lot of stigma attached to the term atheist. And even atheists themselves are often, even when it's just a phone call and they're responding to a phone survey, reluctant to say that they're atheists because, there are all these myths about atheists being immoral, we're nihilistic, we're despondent, we're depressed, there's no meaning in our lives. You often wonder why we just don't throw ourselves off a bridge, right? All these, ridiculous stories. So, again, that's why I like the ARIS survey, because it actually draws out what people really believe, and 12% say they don't believe in God, although actually only a minority said they were atheists, but whatever. All right. Well, the trend does seem to indicate that, more and more people are becoming non-religious. So what does this portend for the future? Will the 21st century see the waning of belief in monotheism, such that, in 30 or 40 years, no one will believe in God any more than they believe in Zeus? Will we have maybe another increment of people who are non-believers, but will also retain a large segment of believers? Or is it possible we've actually reached the high water mark for non-religious, and there'll be a rollback coming, a religious resurgence? This is something that some people have predicted, in part based on the growth of Islam in Europe. Well, the answer to that question is, I don't know. And I don't think anyone else really knows, because one thing history tells us, it's actually very hard to predict religious trends. If you were living in the Roman Empire in, say, 150 of the Common Era, you would have predicted that in 150 years, Christianity would be the official religion of the Roman Empire. If you were living in the Middle East in the 600s of the Common Era, more likely than not, you'd be a Christian. You would have predicted just in 20 years, the whole Mediterranean world would be dominated by this new faith coming out of, from all places, the Arabian Peninsula, which was like a backwater, right? So it's very hard to predict religious trends. But one thing we have to keep in mind is that religious belief is resilient. There have been some people who've written books saying there's a genetic basis for religious belief. I tend to doubt that it actually has a biological foundation. But even if that's not the case, it's clear that it has deep cultural and social roots. And beliefs that have been around for thousands of years likely are not going to disappear in the space of a few decades. I like this slide, by the way, because to me it just kind of captures nicely what I see as the situation of religion. I think the intellectual foundations for religion have been taken away. There's nothing there, The design argument and arguments like that are really persuade no one, really, of any standing. But religion is clinging tenaciously to life. And I think that it may stay that way for a while. So if I had to make any prediction, I would predict that the number of non-religious people is going to grow in developed countries and in the United States, but it's not going to grow exponentially. It's going to be a slow growth. So for the next few generations at least, what we're going to face is what I call a mixed population. We'll have a large percentage of people who are non-religious, but also a large percentage of people who are religious. And then within that religious group, we're going to have much more diversity than we had in the past. People used to talk about the Christian West, Western Europe and North America. That's obviously changed quite a bit. Not only do we have people with Jewish faith, but again, Islam is growing, not just in Europe, but in the United States. A lot more Eastern religions are getting footholds in the developed countries. So even within the religious group, we're going to have much more diversity. So we're going to be faced with a situation of unprecedented religious pluralism. And that unprecedented religious pluralism is one reason, not the only reason, but one reason why I think secularism is necessary. But before I give my argument about why secularism is necessary, I'm going to have to define what secularism is. And that's really important because secularism, the concept of secularism, suffers a lot from misapprehension and misconstrual and misinterpretation. It's especially true among some religious people. And for them, secularism operates as kind of the ultimate scare word. They don't really know what it means. They can't define it, but they know it means something vaguely evil, right? It's something horrible, connotes something really bad. So all they know is that if secularism triumphs, it's going to become illegal to pray. And religious people will be herded into concentration camps, and white bread will be outlawed. All these things will happen if secularism triumphs. And I exaggerate actually only slightly. I mean, if you look at some of the pronouncements from some religious right people, I don't know if you remember the 2010 book that Newt Gingrich published. It was a bestseller. Unfortunately, he sold a lot more copies probably than my book will sell, at least, well, a few more copies. It was entitled Stopping Obama's Secular Socialist Machine, right? Kind of the twin fears of the religious right. Just a few weeks ago, Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham, gave a talk in which he was referencing the fact that, you know, when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, we were overjoyed because we thought communism was coming to an end. But it turned out that a worse evil was taking the place of communism, and that was secularism. And then, of course, just a couple weeks ago, Bobby Jindal, a great American politician, considered seriously by many as a credible candidate for the Republican nomination for president, gave a speech in which he said there was a greatest threat to America, which he identified. It wasn't climate change, it wasn't threats from overseas, from ISIS or Russia, it wasn't economic instability or economic inequality, certainly wasn't, you know, race discrimination. For him, the greatest threat to America is secularization. So there's a lot of fear about, you know, secularism and secularization that's built up on the religious right. Now, some of that, of course, is just manipulation, right? The religious right people, they see it to their advantage to get their audience, their supporters worked up about this. But some of it is due to legitimate confusion. And I think the confusion is this. Some people equate secularism with atheism. And then, of course, they go on to think that all atheists want to take away freedom of religion, right? Which, of course, is wrong. But secularism is not the same thing as atheism. In fact, they don't even belong in the same category. Secularism is an ethical, political philosophy, if you will, about how we should structure our governance. Atheism is a belief about the ultimate nature of things. You know, it's a belief that essentially there's the natural world. There are no supernatural beings. One belief does not entail the other. You can be a religious person, and there are millions of religious people who embrace secularism, and that's a good thing. That's something we want to encourage. By the way, when I've given this talk in the past, some people raise the question, and, you know, they say, well, that's true that you can be religious and embrace secularism, but there is an entailment in the other direction. Of course, if you're atheist, you're going to be secular. Actually, no, they're logically independent, and I've known personally some atheists who are not secular, who don't think secularism is a good idea. And you ask why? It's because they have the same view of religion that Karl Marx did. It's the opiate of the masses, and it's a way to keep people in line, and as long as religion doesn't interfere with free markets, they don't care, right? It's a way to keep people happy. Fortunately, I think there are only a few people like that, at least I've only known a few personally, but there is that viewpoint out there. In any event, they are logically independent points of views. Secularism is not logically equivalent to atheism. All right, well then what is secularism? That's enough of a preface. Now I have to get down to definitions. Well, in my view, secularism has two components. And the first component is something that I think is familiar to everyone in this room, certainly. I call it secularism in the narrow sense. It's the idea of separation of church and state. Government should not interfere with religious affairs, and by the same token, religion should not interfere with government affairs. This is a core principle of this country's democracy. We were the first explicitly secular state. So you would think, of course, that separation of church and state would be something that would be almost universally accepted in the United States, which, of course, is not true. And this is actually one of the ironies. There's more resistance to separation of church and state in the United States than there is in many, for example, European countries that actually had established churches, but now recognize the importance of separating government and religion. Because in the United States, there are large segments of the population, I would say a minority, but a substantial minority, that insist this whole idea of separation of church and state is just wrong. It's a myth. Instead, we are a Christian nation, right? The Christian nation advocates. There have been other groups that have attacked separation of church and state, but I think the main one nowadays are the people who call themselves Christian nation advocates. And, they publish a lot of books out there. David Barton, you may have heard of him. I've looked at some of his books, and there's stuff with quotes, some of which have been proven to be fabricated. But other ones, are authentic, but they're basically irrelevant. Among other things, for example, he quotes a lot from the early colonies, the Mayflower Compact, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you don't need a PhD in history or political science to understand that's essentially irrelevant, because what went on in the early colonies doesn't dictate how the Constitution was framed. And it's the Constitution that established this country, not what went on in the early colonies. The early colonies, many of them were theocracies. I mean, if you lived in Massachusetts in the 1630s and 1640s, wasn't that much different than living in Iran nowadays. I mean, you were, they followed who went to church, restrictions on a lot of activities, and something I found out actually when I was researching my book, I knew they expelled people like Roger Williams. I didn't know they actually executed people. They executed Quakers, for example. They hanged them because, they were non-conforming religious people. But in any event, this, then they claim that, well, the founders of the Constitution, the framers of the Constitution, they were Christian, therefore they must have wanted a Christian nation, right? And one of the key arguments, of course, I'm sure you've heard this, is the phrase separation of church and state does not appear anywhere in the Constitution. So if you say the Constitution is what we should pay attention to and not the early colonial documents, no reference to separation of church and state in the Constitution. That's just a myth that people like you humanists and agnostics and atheists, free thinkers, that's just something that you put out there, right, to try to keep this nation from recognizing its Christian roots. What about those arguments? Well, first of all, let's talk about the argument that because the founders were Christian, they therefore wanted a Christian nation. One thing I think sometimes that we humanists and free thinkers spend too much time on is trying to parse and investigate the beliefs of the founders. And there's a lot of debate about, well, was Jefferson a tepid deist, or was he really an atheist? What was Madison? Was he a Christian, as he said he was in many writings, or was he a deist, or perhaps he was an atheist? How about Adams, Washington, et cetera? I'm not sure it makes that much difference. I think some of the founders were, at best, lukewarm deists. But again, if you're talking about the founders, you're really talking about a group of several hundred individuals. Those are the people who took part in the debates on the Constitution, not just at the federal level, but at the state ratifying conventions. I think it's fair to say probably most of them were at least nominally Christian. But so what? As I said early on, many religious people embrace secularism. So just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you would want a Christian nation. And bear in mind, the framers were very concerned about sectarian violence. It was much more on their mind than perhaps it is even today for us. Again, they were all too familiar with the experience of the early colonies and all the fighting and bloodletting that took place. They were very familiar with the strife that embroiled Europe for 2 centuries with Catholics and Protestants battling each other and different sects of Protestants battling each other. They didn't want that to affect this new nation, the United States. So, in fact, they did not want a Christian nation. They wanted a nation that was separated from religion. And one proof of that is, if you look at the body of the Constitution, is there any reference to God or Jesus in the body of the Constitution? No, there isn't. The only reference to religion in the body of the Constitution, now I'm talking about the body, not the amendments, the only reference to religion in the body of the Constitution is Article 6, which states that there will be no religious test ever imposed for any public office under these United States. So the only reference to religion in the Constitution is actually a negative one, trying to indicate that government doesn't have anything to do with religion. So it really strains credulity to think that somehow the founders wanted a Christian nation, but they somehow neglected to mention Jesus or God in the Constitution. They were working on the Constitution, and maybe at the end they pulled an all-nighter, and it slipped their mind, right? Then 2 weeks later, someone said, oh my God, we forgot to put Jesus in there. And by then it was too late, right? They figured, well, we can't go back now and add Jesus. It would look bad. So, no, of course, that's a ridiculous idea. Especially when you think about it, it had actually been very easy to indicate that this was a Christian nation. It would have only taken 4 words. You could put it right in the preamble. They could have said, in order to found a more perfect union based on Christian principles, then we would have had a Christian nation. And that's something they explicitly decided not to do. So, as I said, this idea that somehow it's a Christian nation and that's what the founders wanted, I think is ridiculous. But at this point, the savvy Christian nation advocate, and that would be maybe 2 or 3 of them, they're going to come back and say, well, okay, at best we're at a standstill. Because it's true, I'll have to concede, there's no reference to Jesus or God in the Constitution. But again, there's no reference to separation of church and state in the Constitution. So, we're even. You make your argument, I make my argument. Well, this argument actually shows a lamentable misunderstanding of the intentions of the founders and of intellectual history. And it's actually ironic that this argument is often made by people who belong to the Tea Party. Tea Partiers often stress the importance of a limited government. And what the founders did establish was actually a limited government, because they set forth what powers the federal government was going to have. And you may recall from your constitutional history, it's Article 1, Section 8, that sets forth the powers of the national legislature. That is the power of Congress. And in there, it sets forth things like, Congress can issue coinage, can regulate commerce, can levy taxes, raise armies, et cetera, et cetera. Not one word about Congress having any authority over religious matters. Much less is there a reference to any kind of joint theological political committee coming up with laws and regulations. What the founders did was establish a government that was limited entirely to civil, secular matters, to matters of this world. A government that had nothing to say about religion. And, if these Christian nation people had any familiarity with intellectual history, they would know the founders were influenced greatly by John Locke. And this is the type of argument that John Locke made in his 2 treatises of government, his letter regarding toleration. He said, we need governments that focus on civil matters, on secular matters, because governments don't have any competence on religious matters. And this philosophy greatly influenced the founders. So this is a proverbial case of, not seeing the forest for the trees. There's no need to have the phrase separation of church and state in the Constitution, because the whole Constitution embodies the notion of separation of church and state. It sets up a government that completely separates government affairs from religious affairs. And just to kind of drive home this point, kind of interesting factoid, some of you may be aware of this already. James Madison often called the founder or the father of the Bill of Rights, with some justification, because in the first Congress he's the one who introduced the Bill of Rights and really pushed them forward. But he actually opposed the Bill of Rights at first. Why would he have opposed the Bill of Rights? Is it because he suddenly had an epiphany and said, oh, yeah, I guess we do have freedom of conscience or whatever? No, of course, he always believed in free speech, freedom of conscience, didn't want government censoring the press. But his view was, we just got through setting up a limited government. If we suddenly add amendments, carving out and making explicit that people have certain rights, that will imply that the government actually has authority over these issues. And of course, the government doesn't have authority over these issues. Government doesn't have authority over religion. Government doesn't have authority over speech. Government can't control the press. Well, we don't need these amendments. That was his view. And if you read the debates, for example, in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, that's the view he put forward. Now, eventually he came around to being persuaded that, well, maybe we should put some explicit reference to these rights in the Constitution. Jefferson, by the way, was instrumental in persuading him. We have the correspondence. Jefferson was actually in France at the time, but he was following the debates about the Constitution. And he wrote to Madison and said, look, you get this and I get this. We know we set up a limited government, but future generations may forget that we set up this limited government, and that was probably a very prescient remark on Jefferson's part. So Madison came around to the view that, okay, we will put express safeguards in the Constitution. That's how we got the Bill of Rights. But as far as Madison was concerned, that really just confirmed the rights that were there already. All right. I could probably go on and on for the rest of this morning talking about the fallacies of the Christian nation argument, but I have to go on because, as I said, separation of church and state is one component, but not the only component of secularism. It's a necessary condition for secularism, but it's not a sufficient condition. If we want a truly secular society, we need something else, especially if we want a democratic secular society. And that's this. We need the broad sense of secularism. And by that, I mean that there should be no religious influence whatsoever on public policy, and discourse, discussions about public policy, should be carried out entirely in secular terms, without any reference to religious doctrine. And religious institutions should not have any kind of privileged position. Well, why do I say this is important? It's important if we want a democratic society. Because if we want a democratic society, that implies, among other things, the government has an obligation to justify its policies to its citizens. And more important, it means we, the people, are supposed to discuss and debate public policy issues, before we vote on referendum, before we vote on candidates, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if you just use common sense, there's one clear, indisputable prerequisite for that democratic discourse to be successful. And as the participants in that discussion have to be able to understand, evaluate, and debate the reasons that others offer for their viewpoints. Because if you don't understand what someone's saying, obviously you're not going to have a very meaningful discussion. And the problem with religion is that religion operates as a private language. Because when you refer to religious doctrines, when you refer to religious texts, and you're using that as the basis for your public policy position, what you're essentially doing is referring to something that has meaning only to a select group of people, to the people who accept your religious doctrines. And you're shutting out of the conversation everyone else. To drive home this point, let's just consider a hypothetical. Let's say, I'm sure actually there are people at this university who could do this. Let's say that there are a number of physicists and mathematicians who said, we should actually be more precise, and you can describe reality using mathematical equations. So what we should do is actually have all our public policy positions expressed in mathematical equations. Well, obviously that's kind of a ridiculous notion. It's ridiculous in part because it would shut out of the discussion a lot of people, including me, right? I couldn't follow that. Probably 99% of the population couldn't follow that. But this idea that, let's phrase everything in the language of higher mathematics, actually is a better situation than using religious doctrine to phrase public policy positions. And why do I say that? Because in principle, we could come up to speed on this, right? We could learn the language of higher mathematics. Might take a couple years for some of us, maybe more like 3 or 4 years, but we could come up to speed on it. That's not the case with religious doctrines. Religious doctrines will always remain meaningful only to people of that particular religion. And when people refer to their texts, whether it's the Old Testament, New Testament, Book of Mormon, Dianetics, whatever it is, they're really just talking to their co-religionists. Again, they're using a private language and they're putting an end to any meaningful conversation. And this is what makes discussion with some religious individuals so frustrating. I'm sure many of you have had some of these encounters, whatever the public policy issue is. Let's just talk about marriage equality, which is something that obviously is being a big issue recently, and the Supreme Court now has the issue before it. There are some religious people who just say, look, obviously I'm going to oppose marriage equality because the Old Testament says that sex between men is an abomination, so I'm not even going to say they even shouldn't have relations, let alone get married. Well, if you try to engage that person, talk about, well, the fact of the matter is that gays make good parents. There's evidence of that. They have stable relations, just like heterosexual couples. Now, the Old Testament says that it's wrong. Well, can you really have a meaningful conversation with that person? Are you able to debate with that person about the pros and cons of recognizing marriage equality? No, obviously you can't, because they've pulled out their faith card. And once they've pulled out their faith card, that ends the conversation. Religion operates as a conversation stopper. It's a way to shut down discussion of public policy as opposed to enhancing it. Now, I think that's a pretty powerful argument for secularism, but there's some people who differ. And actually, my viewpoint, my argument was anticipated a bit by a book that came out in the late 90s. Some of you may have heard of this. It's called The Culture of Disbelief, written by Stephen Carter. He's a Yale law professor. A book, by the way, that actually was supported by Bill Clinton, who encouraged Americans to read it. In part, actually, the book dealt not just with my topic today, but it was in the general thing about how religious people are being marginalized and they're being discriminated against and they're looked down upon, the kind of whining that we've heard now for 15 or 20 years, which is kind of silly. But he did also talk about this issue of public policy, and he said there are some secularists who say that religion should be kept out of public policy discussions. And he gave some arguments about why that's wrong. He said, well, the abolitionists, they use religious rhetoric. The civil rights movement, a lot of them use religious rhetoric, so where would we be if we shut out religion? Not only that, if we shut religion out of public policy discussions, we're essentially silencing believers. Or we're going to force them to restructure their arguments in secular terms. To which I say, so what? Yeah, that is what we're doing. We're forcing them to restructure their arguments in secular terms. And what is wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that. Because if you think about it, it actually is of benefit, not just to us, but to the religious people as well. Because it forces them to think about their positions as opposed to simply parroting a position. Because, if you're forced to restructure your argument in secular terms, you have to think of reasons for your position. And if, in fact, you can't, reformulate a religiously based belief in secular language, maybe you should think that perhaps you've misinterpreted God's commands. Because let me think about this. Why would God ask you to embrace and advocate a position that doesn't make any sense when you try to explain it to someone else? All right? So it actually operates as a much-needed check on religious reasoning. Furthermore, this idea that, telling religious people they should use secular language doesn't impose any burden on them, because it's not like we're saying, well, you have to learn Esperanto or something, right? Secularism, that's just a fancy term for the language of everyday life. It's a language we all use 99% of the time, right? When we, get up in the morning, talk to our partner, make breakfast, listen to the news, go to work, talk to our colleagues, make sales, make purchases, whatever we're doing, treat patients, give legal advice, do the books. We're all using the language of cause and effect, of evidence-based reasoning. We're using the language of secularism. So this is language that religious people are familiar with already. So again, it poses no burden on them. Furthermore, I think it's really just a matter of requiring people to show respect for each other. In a democracy, we're all supposed to have equal standing. We don't have any more authority than anyone else. Any authority we have depends on the force of our reasoning. But if you're using religion in public policy discussions, you're essentially trying to compel people to come to your point of view. You're using your sacred text, whether it's the Bible, the Quran, Book of Mormon, whatever it is, as a weapon to beat people over the head with. And your message basically is, accept my doctrines, accept my doctrines, accept my doctrines. You are not engaging in a discussion. You're simply trying to force people to accept your viewpoint. So, have I indicated that we need to adopt secularism? Or is there a counter-argument? There's a counter-argument. And a little better one than the one Stephen Carter came up with. Because this guy Jeffrey Stout, he's a professor at Princeton. And he's agnostic, by the way, so he doesn't have any religious axe to grind. And in this book, Democracy and Traditions, again, he covered a lot of ground. He talked about political structures generally, but he devoted a few chapters to the topic I'm talking about today. And he said, we shouldn't be too quick to say that religion is a conversation stopper, because there is a way to engage the religious believer. There is a way to have a profitable discussion with the religious adherent. What you have to do is get inside their head, which sounds kind of scary, but at any rate, get inside their head, figure out what arguments they're using, and then you try to show that they're contradictory. You try to show the inconsistencies in their beliefs, or try to show that their premises actually support your position. This is what he means by imminent criticism, not imminent, I-N-E-T, in the sense of something happening right away, imminent in the sense of within. So the whole idea is you get within the perspective of the believer, and then you engage the believer on her or his own terms. Well, how about this? Is this something that can work in public policy discussions? One thing that Stout overlooks, which is critical, is that religious beliefs are not held to the same standards of evidence and reason and consistency and logic as our other beliefs. So it's always going to be open to the religious believer to, basically slip away from your attempt to pin them down and say, oh, I've shown you have an inconsistency here because if you believe X, you're also believing not X. It doesn't make sense. They can say, at the end of the day, well, it's just a matter of faith for me. And faith, as we all know, means not having to supply reasons. And if you think of many of the doctrines of many faiths, they're blatantly inconsistent or contradictory. Just think of two key doctrines of Christianity. The incarnation. What is the incarnation? Jesus was both divine and a human, not one right after the other. It's not like he was Superman, then Clark Kent or whatever. No. Simultaneously, he's got finite intelligence and infinite intelligence. He's got finite power and he's omnipotent. Obviously it makes no sense. It's a blatant contradiction. Which is why the Catholic Church, I was raised Catholic, so like it or not, I'm very familiar with a lot of their explanations, such as they are. That's why the Catholic Church calls the doctrine of the incarnation a mystery, something you have to accept. Same thing with the Trinity. It's a mystery. It's an article of faith. It's hard to explain how you have three gods for the price of one, but we do in Christianity, right? And there are many other doctrines like that that are inconsistent and contradictory. And again, at the end of the day, this idea that, oh, you can force the believer to give up their position because you can show they're inconsistent, no, it doesn't work because religion doesn't follow the same rules of logic. Furthermore, even if we had some believers who tried to be consistent in their reasoning, think of how involved public policy discussions would become. Because, this idea of you have to get into the head of the believer and figure out what doctrines they're using, well, then you have to become familiar with Christianity or Judaism or Islam. That takes some time. Let's just take one public policy issue that's been debated quite a bit. Not so much currently, although I was just in Texas a few weeks ago, and apparently it's still a big issue there. Abstinence-only education. Right? The Bush administration pushed this a lot as an alternative standard sex education. And many religious people wanted abstinence-only education because, in their view, Jesus, he condemned fornication, sex outside of marriage. And therefore, we should, encourage our children to abstain from sex before they get married. Well, if that's the basis for the believer's position, let's think about how you would get into the head of that person and argue from within their premises. Well, at the beginning, yes, you have to look at the Gospels and try to figure out what the different texts mean, which, as we all know, is a labor of some time because the texts mean different things to different people. And then why just restrict yourself to the 4 canonical Gospels? We know now that there were 40 Gospels or more floating around about Jesus in the first couple centuries of the Common Era. You could look at those, try to figure out what Jesus may have said about sex outside of marriage. Then you have, of course, the whole issue of, well, was Jesus a real person? There are a lot of people debating about it. Some people think Jesus was just a myth created by early Christians to justify their beliefs. And, of course, then you come to the big question, or actually 2 big questions. Well, why accept Jesus as opposed to some other prophet? And then, is there really a God? Because anytime you introduce religion, you have to come to that ultimate question. Well, think of how convoluted, involved, and long-lasting these debates are going to be. So if religion doesn't operate as a conversation stopper, you're going to have the opposite problem. It's going to start a conversation that never ends. Because theological discussions never come to any resolution. They go on and on and on. Because again, a believer at the end of the day can always pull out the faith card and just say, well, this is something I believe on a matter of faith. And that's really it. So you will have invested, weeks of study and read the New Testament and what have you, and it's not going to change anyone's opinion. And the thing is, with public policy, we do have to come to a decision eventually. We can't put things on hold while the Council of Trent, decides what theological doctrines we're going to accept. So contrast the religion-laden approach to public policy with the secular approach. Let's take the same issue, abstinence-only education. Well, with any secular public policy approach, the first thing you do is figure out what the objectives are, right? What are the objectives of this policy? What are we trying to do? Well, presumably what we're trying to do is reduce STDs and unwanted pregnancies. So you do empirical studies. You figure out how abstinence-only education works, and you contrast that with standard sex education. And if it were true that abstinence-only education actually reduced STDs and unwanted pregnancies, maybe we should fund it. And of course, the reality is, as you probably know, it's an abject failure. People who take abstinence-only education actually have pregnancies at a higher rate, have a higher rate of sexually transmitted diseases. But in any event, that's how you would do it. And granted, those studies do take a bit of time because you have to follow people for a couple of years. But it is a finite period of time as opposed to the infinite period of time that will be required if we were going to introduce religion into public policy discussions. So, I think I've given a pretty good argument now for why secularism is necessary. So perhaps I could stop at this stage. But no, I can't. I can't stop at this stage because, well, what was the argument that the religious person is going to make now? Not that I've said, we need to have a common language, we need to understand each other. If we introduce religion into public policy discussions, you're introducing a private language, you're just talking about your own faith. He's got one card left to play. Exactly. As Jerry said, morality. Because the fact is, this is what the religious person is going to say. Some public policies have a moral dimension. Not all of them. The number of parking meters you have per city block probably doesn't have a moral dimension. Maybe it does. I don't know. But but there are some public policies that clearly have a moral dimension. stem cell research, assisted dying, same-sex marriage, et cetera, et cetera. So the religious person is going to say, religion is the foundation for morality. So you can't eliminate religion entirely from a public policy debate, because then, you can't talk about these moral aspects. So in the middle chapters of my book, I have to show that, in fact, morality has a secular foundation and clearly doesn't have a religious foundation, that God can't tell us what to do. Again, even if there were a God. And in my book, by the way, I don't have any arguments against the existence of God. They're not necessary for my thesis. Because I said, even if there were a God, he could not direct us as to what we should do. And I have three arguments that I make to prove this point. Three categories of arguments. There's a logical argument, an epistemological argument, and a practical argument. I had to use the word epistemological because I am a philosopher, and I would have my philosopher's union card taken away if I didn't use that word at least once during a discussion. But let's take the logical one. Many in this audience probably are familiar with this. It's actually a shame more people aren't familiar with the Euthyphro argument. Plato made it just 2,500 years ago, so it should be more widely known because it's a devastating argument. And I don't think there's ever been a convincing rebuttal to it. There have been some attempts, which I'll talk about in a moment, but none have succeeded. So in the dialogue Euthyphro, Plato has his character Socrates ask this question. I've changed it a bit because Socrates used the word holy instead of good, but it means the same thing. Is something morally right because God commands it, or does God command something because it is morally right? Let's take the last part of the dilemma first. Does God command something because it's morally right? Well, some people would say, yeah, of course. God's good. He's going to command what is good and just, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if that's your answer, that implies that we human beings have the ability to determine what's right and wrong, good and bad. We have our own independent standards of judgment. Well, if that's true, then God drops out of the picture. Again, doesn't prove he doesn't exist, but in terms of being the source of morality, we don't need God. Well, let's say okay, fine, you take the other horn of the dilemma and you say, no, we just follow whatever God commands. We don't know what's right or wrong or whatever. This is just it. God's commands that count. Well, then essentially you're confessing that we don't know. We don't have standards of right and wrong. We don't have standards of good and bad. We just follow these dictates. But then how do you even know that God is good? Why couldn't we be ruled by some evil demon? And if you think of some of the commands that God supposedly gave in the Old Testament, it would, maybe you have a pretty good reason to think we're being ruled by an evil demon. So either way you look at it, I think it puts us as a believer in a very tough position. And as I said, there have been some believers who have tried to counter this. Thomas Aquinas is a famous example. Again, I think I may have mentioned I was raised Catholic. Very familiar, probably too familiar with Thomas Aquinas. I have nightmares about him. But at any rate, now, to his credit, Aquinas tried to answer questions like this. And his solution was, he was part of the so-called natural law tradition, which many of you may be familiar with. And in the natural law tradition, the view is that human reason can determine certain things to be right and wrong, good and bad, on our own. But there are certain other things where we need God's advice, that we don't know whether they're right and wrong, and we just have to follow God's commands. Was that a solution to this dilemma? Not really, because it actually just pushes the dilemma back one step. Because again, for those things that we can know on our own as being right or wrong, good or bad, again, God drops out of the picture. He's not the source of moral authority. For the things where supposedly, well, we don't know what to do here and we're just following God's commands, again, how do we know whether God is just, good or not? We don't. We just have to follow these dictates. And Aquinas, again, to his credit, didn't dodge the tough questions, at least not all the time. And he actually pulled some examples from the Bible where it seemed like God's commands seem strange, at least. And I think the examples he uses, and I talk about these in the book, God's command to Abraham to kill his son, God's command to the Israelites to steal from the Egyptians before they went on their exodus. Then God's commands to take over the land of Canaan and basically slaughter all the people living there. Not just slaughter the people, but the goats, the sheep, et cetera, right? You may recall in Jericho, the command was not to leave one thing living alive. Aquinas said, superficially these seem like not the nicest things. His answer was, well, these seem unjust, but we have to bear in mind that God is justice. Therefore, they can't be unjust. That's it. I mean, you can look it up. That's in the Summa Theological. That's his answer. Obviously, not a satisfactory answer, right? So you're just arguing in circles. So, as I said, the Euthyphro dilemma, I think, is something that no religious argument has yet overcome. But there's another argument. And I think this is probably the most original part of my book, because I don't think it's been focused on by too many people. And I think it indicates a real weakness in this whole idea, that's prevalent in so many societies, that, to figure out what I have to do, I follow the commands of God. Right? This is what you hear from believers all the time. You humanists, you're just subjective. You have no moral compass or whatever. You just think about things on your own. I follow a command. Therefore, I have an objective foundation because it's the command of God. Well, how do they know that's the command of God? Because how are God's commands communicated to us? They're communicated through revelation. And what is a revelation? It's a message given by God, or more typically some messenger, some angel, something like that, right? To a very select group of individuals. And it's a message that we have no way of verifying whether it's actually been delivered or not. All we have at the end of the day is the say-so of a very few individuals. Because if you think about it, revealed religion, I'm talking about all the revealed religions, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Mormonism, Scientology, et cetera, they all depend on a set of prophets. Prophets that supposedly had these key revelations that were then transmitted to the rest of us. So the slide I have up here shows Joseph Smith, of course, with his head buried in a hat. Now, you may recall that this angel came and showed Joseph Smith these golden plates that had these messages from God on there, the basis for the Book of Mormon. Of course, when people asked to see the golden plates, they mysteriously were taken back by the angel and whatever, right? But don't worry. Joseph Smith had a seer stone that he could use. If he placed it in the bottom of a hat, the Book of Mormon reappeared in Reformed Egyptian, language no one had ever heard of, but using the seer stone, he was able to translate that into English, which is the language of the Book of Mormon. And this is actually how the Book of Mormon came about. He sat in the house of a friend for, I think, a couple of weeks. I forget, unfortunately, the name of the friend right now, the gentleman whose house he was in. He would pull the hat tightly around his face so no one could see what he was looking at. And he dictated the Book of Mormon. Now, this is a scene that fairly calls out for mockery. And, Mormons have been mocked for this because it seems kind of ridiculous, right? But it's no more ridiculous than the revelations that form the basis for more respected faiths, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Scientology, or what have you. They're all based on a revelation that supposedly was given to some person now long ago dead, right? That was then, the revelation was put down in some sacred text. And of course, there's a double gap there. Number one, we have to think there was actually a revelation. Number two, we have to think the text authentically captured the revelation. And then, what do? We, the unprivileged few, or many I should say, who haven't had access to the revelation, just have to follow the word. So we have these few prophets who have had the benefit of talking to God, and then the billions of the schmucks, the rest of us. And our task is just to follow and obey. So this whole, and this is what gets me a lot of times. You've probably heard this, that Judeo-Christianity sets up is the foundation for democracy. You've heard that nonsense a lot, right? First of all, it seems strange because when I read the Bible, it seems like they had a theocratic monarchy. But actually, religion, revealed religion, is inherently anti-democratic because it sets up a cognitive class system. It sets up these few individuals who, throughout history, and again, some of these may not actually be historical figures, which complicates the picture even more. Well, let's just say they were, who supposedly got the word from God, no way to confirm that they got this word. Let's say there was a Moses who came down from the mountain. Well, no one was there to see God talking to him, right? L. Ron Hubbard had his message from God. The angel, Muhammad said the angel Gabriel visited him in a dream, which to me is no more different than saying he dreamt that the angel visited him, but whatever. They had these revelations. That's what we're following. So when someone tells you, some believer tells you, wow, you just have subjective morality. I have objective morality because I'm following God's commands. You tell that person, you're not following God's commands. You're following what you think is God's commands based on what you think was a message given to some person that you think may have lived and whose words may have been put down later in some sacred text. Because that is the foundation, the alleged foundation for religious morality. And it's just ridiculous. And again, this is why I think this is something that is not really appreciated that much by people who are religious and even some critics of religion. It's a key weakness. But leaving aside, the epistemological issue, we also just have the practical problem with revelation. And that is, the revelations clash, right? Because we have all these different revelations, and they're telling us different things. And what are we supposed to believe? So, one God says, don't eat shellfish or have a milkshake with a cheeseburger. And another God says, order what you want from the luncheon menu. I don't care. One God says, don't drink alcohol. Another says, hey, bottoms up. Another God says, give me your foreskins to seal the deal. Another God says, hey, I really don't need that. Don't want that, right? And the list goes on and on. So which revelation are we supposed to accept? But it's even worse than what I portray here. Because what I portray here, of course, are the clashes between different religions. But even within one religion, you have unending arguments about what God's commands supposedly are. What is the revelation? Because, again, the revelation is put down in some sacred text, and then people argue endlessly, what does that text mean? How are we supposed to interpret it? And you can think of all the disputes throughout history where there have been people on the same faith, at least nominally the same faith, who have interpreted things 180 degrees differently. I'm so glad that President Obama a few weeks ago referenced the fact that, when Christianity, it was used to justify some bad things, the Crusades, slavery, whatever. He got a lot of flack for that, which was absurd, because he was just saying something was historically accurate. And, speaking of slavery, Stephen Carter, in that book I referenced a moment ago, he made a big deal about how the abolitionists used religious rhetoric, which is true, they did. Well, what do you think the Southern preachers were saying? They used the same book. They referenced the Bible. They referenced the Old Testament and the New Testament. And they came up with an argument for slavery. And I have to say, based on my acquaintance with the Bible, they may have had the better of the argument, because Jesus nowhere condemns slavery, and the Old Testament is accepted as just kind of a fact of life. And in fact, the only thing God says in the Old Testament about slavery is he tells the Israelites, you can't make slaves of your fellow tribe members. You have to go outside your tribe to make slaves. So, we have these continual disputes within religion. And as I say in my book, this idea that you can rely on text, the Bible, the Quran, or whatever for guidance, is just so absurd, because these texts are infinitely malleable. You can read into them whatever you want. And because they're infinitely malleable, they're infinitely worthless. In fact, I issue this challenge on my book. I say, give me any proposition you want, no matter how repugnant. Give me 24 hours, and I will find a scriptural verse that can be used to justify it. And I'm not exaggerating. And I guess to drive home this point, this is actually something that came about after I wrote my book. But I think this is very striking. This is actually an article that appeared in the Washington Post just a few weeks ago. And the topic was the burning alive, the immolation of the Jordanian pilot by ISIS. And the headline says, Islamic State says immolation was justified. Some experts on Islam say no. So what's this article deal with? It deals with who has the better interpretation of the Quran, right? So, for example, it says the use of immolation was shocking because it was so unusual. Burning someone to death is almost unheard of in the modern Middle East. I'm happy to hear that. And throughout much of Islamic history. But ISIS relied on certain Quranic verses, especially the verse that's found in chapter or surah 16, verse 126, which calls for retribution. And it forms the basis for qisas, which is the concept of retribution in Islamic law. And it goes on to quote this expert, Hassan, an analyst with the Delma Institute, who he says, well, ISIS may be applying qisas broadly because it's not clear, quote, it's not clear who was burned by the pilot, close quote. Like, that makes the difference? Anyway, it goes on and talks about the different ways the Quran has been interpreted, and this just sums it all up here. This is a quote. As I said, I find this just obscene. It says, quote, theology matters a lot in this context. Theology matters a lot in this context? Well, then so much for the worse for theology, or to put it more colloquially, fuck theology. Because if you're telling me that we can't tell through use of our own moral compass that intentionally burning someone alive is wrong, and instead we have to argue about what the Quran means, or what the Bible means, or what the Book of Mormon means, then we are still infants. Humanity is still in this childhood, and we will never outgrow our childhood until we get beyond this idea that we resolve moral questions by looking at writings that were put down centuries and thousands of years ago and just reflected the tribal customs of the people at the time. We need to reason together about what is just and moral, and we have the ability to do that. In any event, given the unreliability of revelation, we can't tell what God has commanded. We can't even tell whether he's issued a command. God can't tell us what to do, because again, we don't know if he's even spoken. So if we are to live together in peace, if we are to collaborate together to build a just society, a society that benefits everyone, that respects the human rights of everyone, we can't look to God for help. We need to reason ourselves. We need to reason together. And to do that, we need to be able to understand to each other. We need to be able to engage each other. We need to be able to talk to each other. And the only way to do that is to use a common language, and that is the language of secularism. So that's why I say secularism is not only a good thing, it is a necessary thing. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
What's the significance of the cover of the book? Is that 100 different flowers? Or?
Yes, right. Two things. First of all, it shows that buying the book is a win-win proposition. Because if you don't like the book, you just tear the cover off, you put it on the wall, you have instant art. So that's it. It's a very pretty cover. No, the real thing is the different flowers reflect the fact that we are in a religiously pluralistic society. So we have all these different beliefs, but if we embrace secularism, we can flourish together. Okay? That's the message of the cover.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Really, I don't say it lightly.
Okay.
Can I call you an iconoclastic?
Sure, if you want to.
Okay, I want to be more iconoclastic than you are.
Okay.
Because this thing has bothered me for years and years. Obviously, I agree with everything you said, almost.
Okay.
Why are we looking backward like these people are looking at God, what he said, or the prophet, or this or that?
Right.
to the founding fathers. Who cares what they thought? I don't.
Right. Well, you're right. I mean, we shouldn't be completely deferential to what the founding fathers thought because, among other things, they had different notions of who should participate in democracy. You know, they had like property qualifications and obviously racial qualifications. So obviously the founding fathers are not in themselves, you know, they're not religious authorities, they're not cult figures either, but they did draft the Constitution, and the intent behind the Constitution, at a minimum, illuminates our discussion about the Constitution. Whether it necessarily binds us completely, different question. I obviously am of the view, as are many secular people, we have a living Constitution. The language of the Constitution is important. I don't think it can just be ignored, but it does have to be interpreted within the context of our time. And that's one of the, one of the counter arguments to that, people like Scalia say, you have to be an originalist. It's simply what, the founders intended, and we have to stick closely to that. It's hard actually to determine. Remember, when you talk about the founders, you're talking about several hundred people. They all didn't have the same exact intention. And if anything, many of the founders, because they realized they were drafting a document that they hoped would last for a long time, probably had the intention that people would, in later generations, would interpret it reasonably given the conditions then existing. But anyway, yeah, I mean, they shouldn't be held up as some figures where we have to listen, closely to what every word they said. On the other hand, I think we should pay attention to their kind of overreaching goals and objectives, because I think that does inform our understanding of the Constitution.
Jefferson, who was a deist, when he was elected, the ministers of Washington came to him as a group to tell him what God wanted him to do. And he informed them that he preferred that God told him what he wanted rather than the ministers. So my statement is secularists need to tell religionists we prefer God to tell us.
That's one way of doing it. Although I guess I would prefer just to say to keep God out of it entirely. Again, my argument doesn't make it. My book doesn't make an argument against the existence of God, but it does say that if we're going to work together to build a society that benefits everyone and talk to each other, we need to talk to each other about our human interests and human needs. And I think we have the capability, we have the reason and intelligence to do that without appealing to God.
Hello, thank you. I'm a Sufi monk from Iran.
Okay.
If I go back to Iran, I'll be arrested right now on both being a part of Iran's Green Movement as well as on being a Sufi. I came this morning from a church to here, and I'm traveling the country creating circles of nonviolence and collaboration. One of the projects is to have Jews, Muslims, and Christians once in a while hold their weekly worship sessions in the house of the worship of the other. And I have flyers, by the way. And my question is, the purpose of these circles of nonviolence and collaboration is, as you just finished saying, we have a whole lot of issues on Earth right now, from climate change to, poverty, to all kinds of gamut of issues that give rise to all forms of violence. I'm a Muslim, true Muslim, so to speak, quote unquote, and therefore I am against violence and I am for nonviolence as a value. Now, that puts me in a position when I talk with my atheist and secular brothers and sisters, I am defender of their rights inside Iran, by the way. When I talk with them, I say, whether we like it or not, most humanity, whether they are infants and we have really become smart or something, most humanity speaks the language of mystery, of God, or whatever. Climate change affects you as a secular or atheist person exactly the same way as, ISIS that claims to be Islamic. We need to find a common language that respects everybody's belief and sees, quote unquote, the divine very broadly interpreted in everyone, including this microphone, which is a distant cousin to us.
Okay. Do you have a question?
My question is,
okay.
when we talk and we think that we have found the Holy Grail in terms of a language, and we are dealing with common ground issues, climate change being one of them, how do we build a way of dialoguing and collaboration so that we can actually solve common ground problems?
I think the way we do it is, again, appealing to the language that is common to everyone. And the language that is common to everyone is the language of secularism. Especially when you're talking about climate change, you're talking about science. Now, I certainly don't mean, I emphasized, I think in my talk and in my book, I don't want to exclude religious people from the conversation. That would be self-defeating. Obviously, religious people, whatever their beliefs, should take part. And, using secular language to discuss policy issues in no way implies that, we're, disparaging the person's beliefs, their faith, or what have you. Because you can be a religious person and still accept secularism as the way to discuss our common concerns. And you can even, as I point in the book, if you want to say, well, I'm inspired to accept these principles because I'm a Christian or I'm a Muslim, what have you, again, nothing wrong with that, no more than I could say I'm inspired by Shakespeare or by Homer to believe in justice. Nothing wrong with that, but when it comes to putting forth arguments, we have to talk in terms of evidence, of scientific knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how I would approach that question.
See, you had a circular reasoning in what you said. You said the common ground language is the language of secularism.
That is correct.
And then you built, so you came with the premise of common language is the secularism, and you forgot that that's not the language that a lot of people accept. So it's not common language.
Okay, well, two things. And then we'll have to let other people have the microphone. But I appreciate your questions. They're valuable questions. Actually, I think the language of secularism is the language that everyone accepts. It's a language they use for almost everything in their daily lives. For certain issues, some religious people will insist on saying, well, no, because this touches on some moral question or what have you, I have to refer to the Quran or the Bible or whatever it is, the Book of Mormon. And that's what I'm saying we can't do, because as soon as you open the door to that, you're going to have all these different conflicting religious viewpoints. You indicated you're a Muslim. Fine, I respect, you've presumably arrived at that position after giving it some thought. That's fine. Other people, though, are going to arrive at different religious positions. Even within Islam, you're a Sufi Muslim. Obviously, there are different strains of Islam. There are, Sunnis and Shiites and what have you. There are Ahmadi Muslims. Within Christianity, there are 57 different varieties of Christianity. People always have these different beliefs. So the idea that, we have to allow their religious beliefs into the public square when we're talking about common public concerns, public policies, I think is not a solution. It's a non-starter. It's something that will lead to impasse. What we need to do is use the language of everyday life, which is what the language of secularism is.
Thank you for your talk this morning. I could be mistaken, but I suspect that you're mostly preaching to the choir this morning. So my question is, how can we get your point across to the people who most need to hear it, that would be fundamentalist and fanatical religious believers?
Just keep trying to engage. It's like anything else. And I've had this question again at some other talks. and it comes off in different contexts. Some people will say, well, you say we should try to persuade religious people to accept secularism. They're not going to do that, so why don't we just argue, against their religious beliefs and tell them, their religious beliefs are unfounded. Well, I don't think that will work that much either. I mean, different arguments work for different people. And I'm certainly not saying we should give up critique of religion where it's called for. And if we want to have debates about the existence of God, that's great too. We sponsor those debates. But I think the more likely approach, at least in the near term, will be to encourage religious people to understand, just as a matter of their own self-interest and as a matter of prudence, if they want to engage other people in discussions that are beneficial, there's no point in simply insisting on their religious doctrines, because that's not going to persuade anyone. They need to couch their religious doctrines, think about them, phrase them in secular language, so that if they want to advocate for a certain position, it actually makes sense to other people. And I think the good thing is, again, many religious people already are secular. The so-called liberal or moderate religious people, many of them are secular people in terms of how they approach public policy. They have their own private faith, perhaps. They believe in God, but they understand in a democracy, you can't appeal to religious doctrine as a basis for solving public policy questions. And then finally, get my book more widely distributed. What can I say? Get it out there, and more people will be persuaded. Yeah.
Do you think you could give a version of this talk in a church?
Sure, I could give a version of this talk in a church. I'd welcome that opportunity. My publisher did send the book to a few religious magazines, I think to Christianity Today and what's the other one? First Things. But so far, no review yet, so we'll see.
Well, let's give Ron another big hand. Wonderful presentation. Some of us will go to lunch if you're interested in the cafeteria, and everybody go visit our booth over at the book fair.